Margaret stood in front of the mirror, her fingertips tracing the fine lines on her face. The woman staring back at her was familiar, yet different. Her once bright eyes had softened, framed by silver strands of hair. Her hands, steady and strong, in her younger years, now carried the gentle tremor of time. She let out a quiet sigh. Where did the years go? There was a time when she moved through the world effortlessly, dancing in the kitchen, running up the stairs without a second thought, laughing with friends who now existed only in memories. Life had been full of motion, full of people. But now the world seemed to move on without her. The phone rang less. Invitations came less frequently. The reflection in the mirror felt like a reminder of all that had changed. A quiet ache settled in her chest. Had time taken too much? Had she become invisible? Then, as if from somewhere deep within, she remembered something her grandmother once said when Margaret was just a girl. Aging is not about fading. It is about becoming. You are not losing yourself. You are unfolding. At the time, Margaret had brushed it off, unable to imagine a day when those words would matter. But now, as she stood there, watching the evening light cast a golden hue, over her reflection she wondered, what if aging wasn't something to fight? What if it was something to embrace? The Buddha taught that suffering arises not from change itself, but from our resistance to it. Impermanence is not a curse. It is the nature of all things. We grow, we transform, we let go. The pain comes not from aging, but from clinging to what was instead of opening our hearts to what is. What if, instead of mourning the years gone, she could celebrate the wisdom, the resilience, and the beauty that had come with time? What if growing older was not about loss, but about discovering a new kind of richness, one that youth could never know? Today we will explore 5 profound Buddhist truths about aging that may change the way you see this chapter of your life. These lessons are not filled with regret. They are filled with freedom. So take a deep breath. Set aside the fear, the longing, the resistance. What you're about to hear might just shift the way you see the rest of your life. And if this message speaks to you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Let's walk this journey together. And if you find wisdom in these words, consider subscribing to Buddhist Life Philosophy for more insights on embracing life with peace, purpose, and mindfulness. Aging is not the closing of a book. It is simply the turning of a page. And the next chapter, it's yours to write. Margaret sat on her porch, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. The late afternoon sun cast long golden streaks across the lawn, and in the distance, she could hear the laughter of neighborhood children playing. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound drift through her like an old song. It was comforting, yet bittersweet. Once, this yard had been filled with the laughter of her own children. Once, the phone had rung constantly, friends checking in, invitations to dinner. The rhythm of a life intertwined with so many others. Now the house stood quieter. The phone calls had grown less frequent, and some friends, the ones who had been there through so many seasons of her life, had moved away or passed away. There was a time when this thought left her with a deep sadness. Had she really mattered if, in the end, she would simply fade from memory? It is a question that lingers in the minds of many as they age. We spend decades building, striving, leaving our mark, believing that if we do it well enough, we will be remembered. But time moves forward, with or without us. Our names, our stories, even the homes we cherish, will eventually be forgotten. At first, this realization can feel like a loss. But what if it is not a loss at all? What if being forgotten is not something to fear, but something to embrace? The gentle disappearance of footprints on the beach. When the tide recedes, the footprints left in the sand slowly dissolve, swept away by the waves. Yet no one would say that the walk along the shore was meaningless just because the marks are no longer visible. The beauty was in the walk itself, in the feeling of the sand beneath the feet, in the moments of peace it brought. Life is the same way. We are here for a short while, leaving traces in the hearts of others, knowing that in time, those traces will blend into the great expanse of existence. And that is okay. A Zen master once said, "Do not seek to leave a name behind. Instead, leave behind kindness, wisdom, and love. These things do not vanish." The river that never holds on to water. There is a story about a young monk who once asked his teacher, "Master, does it not sadden you that when you pass away people may forget your name?" The old master smiled and pointed to the river flowing past the monastery. "Tell me, where is the water that was here yesterday?" The monk hesitated. "It has flowed on," the teacher nodded. "Yet the river remains. We are like that river. We do not need to hold on to every drop of water to know that it has nourished the land. We do not need to be remembered by name to know that we have made a difference. Think about the teachers who shaped your life. Do you remember all their names? Perhaps not. But their lessons, their encouragement, their belief in you, it is still with you. Think about the kindness of strangers who once helped you when you least expected it. Their faces may have faded, but their goodness remains. This is the true meaning of legacy, not being remembered, but leaving behind something that matters. A different kind of legacy Margaret thought of her grandmother. She couldn't recall every conversation they had, but she remembered the warmth of her hugs, the way she always smelled of lavender, the sound of her soft laughter on summer evenings. And wasn't that what truly mattered? One day Margaret decided to start something new. Instead of worrying about being forgotten, she focused on what she could do now, in the present. She began writing letters to her grandchildren, not about achievements or regrets, but about the small, beautiful moments of life. Watching the first snowfall, the joy of sharing a meal, the comfort of an old song. She planted a small garden, not for anyone else to admire, but simply for the pleasure of watching things grow. She started leaving little notes of encouragement in library books for strangers to find. She spent more time being fully present with the people who were still here. Instead of lamenting the past, she let herself love the present in all its quiet beauty. The beauty of letting go. One evening, Margaret walked along the shore, watching the tide roll in. She knelt down and drew a heart in the wet sand, watching, as the waves gently lapped at the edges. Within minutes, the heart had disappeared, but Margaret felt no sadness. The moment had existed. It had been real. And that was enough. Aging teaches us to let go, not in a way that feels like loss, but in a way that feels like peace. Instead of clinging to the fear of being forgotten, we can shift our focus. What if we embraced the joy of simply being? Margaret took a deep breath, listening to the waves. She was here. She was alive. And that was enough. Aging is not about chasing a legacy. It is about making every moment meaningful, so that when our time comes, we can go in peace, knowing that the river of our life has nourished others along the way. Margaret used to walk effortlessly up the stairs, carrying baskets of laundry, never giving a second thought to the strength of her legs. She could reach for a jar on the highest shelf without hesitation, her arms steady and sure. But now, even a short walk left her knees aching. Her hands, once precise and steady, trembled when she buttoned her coat. The body she had known for so many years, the one that had carried her through childhood adventures, held her babies, danced in the kitchen, felt unfamiliar, as if it belonged to someone else. At first she resisted. She pushed herself harder, refusing to acknowledge the stiffness in her joints, the slower pace of her steps. She scolded herself for the extra weight she carried, for the wrinkles on her hands, for the graying strands in her hair. She fought against time as if sheer willpower could undo its effects. But time is not a battle to be won. And in fighting her own body, she was only making herself suffer. One afternoon, Margaret sat in her garden, rubbing her aching knees, feeling frustrated with how much effort it took just to kneel down. She watched the trees swaying gently in the wind, their branches moving with ease. Then she noticed something. The old oak tree in the corner of her yard, the one that had stood there for decades, had lost several of its branches over the years. Its bark had deepened with ridges, its limbs not as strong as they once were. And yet, it still stood. It still provided shade. Birds still nested in its branches. It had not fought against time. It had adapted, grown into something different, but no less valuable. Margaret took a deep breath, letting go of the frustration she had been carrying. Her body was not betraying her. It was simply changing, just as everything in nature does. The problem was not in aging itself, but in her refusal to accept it. The Buddha taught that suffering arises when we cling to things that must inevitably change. Our bodies are impermanent. They will shift, weaken, wrinkle. To resist this truth is to invite suffering. But to embrace it, to honor the body for all it has done, instead of resenting it for what it can no longer do, is the path to peace. Margaret realized she had spent too much time mourning the loss of what once was, instead of appreciating what still remained. Her hands, though unsteady, could still hold a loved one's hand. Her legs, though slower, could still carry her through a beautiful walk in the park. Her body, though different, was still hers, and it deserved care, not criticism. That evening, she sat by her bedside and whispered, "Thank you." Not in frustration, not in resignation, but in gratitude. She began treating her body like an old, loyal friend, rather than an enemy. Instead of punishing herself for what she could no longer do, she focused on what she still could. She started each morning by stretching gently, not to force her body into something it wasn't, but to listen to it, to move in a way that felt good. She swapped out the harsh diets of her younger years for nourishing meals that made her feel strong. She walked, not to chase youth, but to appreciate the air in her lungs, the ground beneath her feet. One day, she passed by a ballet studio where young dancers moved gracefully across the floor. She felt a pang of longing. She had once loved to dance. But instead of walking away in sadness, she stepped inside. She signed up for a beginner's movement class, not for performance, not to reclaim the past, but simply for the joy of movement. She danced in a new way, slower, softer, but with just as much heart. Aging is not about trying to be who we once were. It is about caring for who we are now. The body is not a machine that eventually breaks down. It is a living, evolving companion that has carried us through every stage of life. It has healed from sickness, adapted to stress, carried the weight of our worries and joys. And in return, it asks only for kindness, for patience, for gratitude. Margaret no longer looked at herself in the mirror with disappointment. She saw the soft lines around her eyes and knew they were carved from years of laughter. She saw the silver in her hair and thought of it as strands of moonlight, a testament to the wisdom she had gained. She saw her hands, no longer as steady as before, but still capable of comforting, of creating, of giving. One morning, as she sat in the park, she watched a mother help her small child take their first steps. The toddler wobbled, arms flailing, knees unsure. But the mother did not scold the child for being unsteady. She smiled, encouraged, held out her hands in support. Margaret realized that this is how we should treat our bodies as they age, with the same patience, the same tenderness, the same gentle encouragement we give to a child learning to walk. She closed her eyes, feeling the breeze on her face, the steady rhythm of her breath. She was here. She was alive. And that was enough. Our bodies will change. They will slow down. They will wrinkle, soften, grow into something different. But if we learn to embrace them with love rather than resentment, we will find a new kind of freedom. A freedom not in resisting time, but in flowing with it, like the trees bending with the wind, like the river that never fights its course. Aging is not a loss. It is an invitation to move differently, to care more deeply, to live with gratitude for every step, every breath, every moment we are given. And that, in itself, is a gift. Margaret sat by the window, watching the autumn leaves drift to the ground. The trees, once full and vibrant, were now shedding their golden layers, surrendering to the change of the season. She sighed, tracing her finger along the edge of her teacup. She had seen many seasons pass, but this one felt different. Her world had grown quieter over the years. Friends who once filled her days with laughter had moved away, some too caught up in their own lives, others lost to time. Family visits had become less frequent. Even her closest friend, Eleanor, the woman who had been by her side through every triumph and heartbreak, had passed away last spring. The silence left behind felt heavier than she had expected. There was a time when she would have fought against this emptiness, reaching out to grasp the connections slipping through her fingers. But today, watching the leaves fall, she wondered, wasn't this the way of life? The Buddha taught that impermanence is at the heart of all things. Everything changes. People come and go, just like the leaves that bud in spring, flourish in summer, and gently return to the earth in autumn. The pain does not come from the change itself, but from our resistance to it. She thought of Eleanor. The two of them had met in their 20s, working at the same small bookstore downtown. What began as casual conversations about literature soon turned into deep, late-night discussions about life, love, and dreams. They had been inseparable: weddings, children, losses, joys, and the mundane, everyday moments in between. Then one day, Eleanor was gone. A simple phone call had shattered the illusion that they had more time. Margaret had spent months aching for her friend's presence, replaying old conversations in her mind, wishing for just one more afternoon together. But as the seasons passed, she realized something. Eleanor had not truly left. The lessons she had taught, the laughter they had shared, the way she had always known the right thing to say, all of it remained, woven into the fabric of Margaret's life. She could hear Eleanor's voice in her head when she stood at a crossroads, feel her warmth in the books they once read together, sense her presence in the quiet moments of reflection. Not everyone is meant to stay forever. Some people walk beside us for decades. Others drift in and out like passing ships. But every single one of them serves a purpose. Some teach us lessons, some offer love, some challenge us to grow. And when their time in our lives comes to an end, it does not mean their presence was any less meaningful. One day Margaret visited an old park where she and Eleanor used to sit and talk for hours. She brought a small notebook and began writing down the things she had learned from her friend, the advice, the kindness, the small habits and sayings that had shaped her. As she wrote, she realized that Eleanor would never truly be gone. She lived on in every story, in every piece of wisdom passed down, in the love she had given so freely. From that day forward, Margaret made it a habit to honor the people who had touched her life. Whenever she missed someone, she would do something in their memory, bake the recipe her mother had once taught her, share a joke her father used to tell, recommend a book Eleanor had once loved. Instead of mourning what was lost, she celebrated what had been given. She also learned to embrace the people who remained. Instead of longing for old friendships that had faded, she opened her heart to new connections. She started talking to the barista at her favorite cafe, sharing stories, with the woman she always saw at the library. She understood now that life was always offering her new companions, if only she was willing to let them in. One afternoon, as she sat in the park, a young woman with a book in her lap looked up and smiled. "Excuse me," she said. "I couldn't help but notice. You're reading one of my favorite novels." Margaret smiled back. "A friend of mine introduced me to it years ago. She had wonderful taste in books." The two began talking, exchanging favorite passages, discussing the characters, as if they were old acquaintances. By the time Margaret left the park, she felt lighter, as if a new leaf had just begun to grow on the tree of her life. We cannot hold on to everyone we love. Some people will drift away, some will be taken too soon, some will quietly fade into the background, but their presence in our lives is never wasted. The love we shared does not disappear. It transforms, settles into the corners of our hearts, shaping who we are, and in the same way that people leave, new ones will always arrive. The friend you have not yet met, the stranger who might one day become family, the passing conversation that sparks something deep within you. Life is constantly weaving new connections, offering new moments of belonging. Margaret no longer feared the ebb and flow of relationships. She understood now that love does not die when people leave. Margaret stood in front of the mirror, studying the face staring back at her. The sharp cheekbones of her youth had softened, her once dark hair now streaked with silver. The skin around her eyes bore the fine lines of time, the evidence of countless smiles, quiet sorrows, and whispered secrets shared in the dark. She reached up, gently tracing the wrinkles on her forehead. There was a time when she had admired this reflection without hesitation. She remembered standing in front of this very mirror decades ago, running her fingers through thick, chestnut-brown hair, marveling at the smoothness of her skin. Back then, she hadn't questioned her beauty. She had worn it effortlessly, unaware that one day she would see it differently. Now, the world around her sent a different message. Beauty, it seemed, belonged to the young. Advertisements promised to erase wrinkles, tighten skin, bring back the past. Her friends spoke in hushed voices about hair dyes, anti-aging creams, and cosmetic procedures. At social gatherings, she sometimes felt invisible, as if age had made her fade into the background. One afternoon, Margaret visited a small cafe, her usual spot for reading and people-watching. At the next table, two young women sat whispering and giggling, taking selfies, adjusting their makeup, checking their reflections in their phones. Margaret watched them with a mixture of nostalgia and amusement. She remembered being that age, thinking beauty was something that could be perfected with the right lipstick or the right angle. As she stirred her tea, an elderly woman walked in, her silver hair pulled into a neat bun, her hands resting gently on a wooden cane. She moved slowly, but with a quiet grace. Margaret noticed the way her eyes sparkled when she greeted the barista, the way she sat with an effortless dignity, as if she belonged wherever she went. She wasn't young, yet she radiated something rare, something deeper than youth, something that could not be captured in a photograph. Margaret realized then that beauty had never been about the absence of wrinkles or the smoothness of skin. It was about presence. It was about the way someone carried themselves, the kindness in their voice, the wisdom in their gaze. She thought of the elders she had admired throughout her life, her grandmother, whose hands had been rough from years of work, but whose touch was always gentle. Her old neighbor, whose face was lined with years of laughter, whose very presence had felt like warmth. None of them had looked young, yet they had all been beautiful. The Buddha taught that attachment to youth is a form of suffering. We cling to what once was, resisting the natural flow of time, believing that beauty exists only in what is fleeting. But true beauty, the kind that lasts, comes not from fighting time, but from embracing it. That night, Margaret sat by her window, watching the full moon rise. She remembered something her grandmother had once said. The cherry blossom is beautiful in spring, but so is the ancient pine that has stood for 100 winters. One fades quickly, the other endures, and yet both are beautiful in their own way. She realized then that beauty does not disappear with age, it transforms. It deepens, like the lines in a well-loved book, like the soft glow of a candle burning low. Margaret decided to stop chasing the impossible dream of looking young again. Instead, she would care for herself in a way that honored her body rather than trying to erase the years that had shaped her. She started wearing colors that made her feel alive, not because they made her look younger, but because they made her feel like herself. She stopped hiding her silver hair and let it shine. She smiled more, knowing that laughter lines were the markings of a life well lived. One evening, as she walked through the park, a little girl ran past her, giggling, her mother trailing behind. The child stopped suddenly, staring at Margaret, with wide eyes. "You look like a fairy," the little girl said, tilting her head in wonder. Margaret laughed. "Why is that?" The girl shrugged. "Your hair is all shiny, like moonlight, and your eyes look like they know magic." Her mother smiled apologetically, but Margaret only chuckled, feeling something warm bloom in her chest. A child had seen in her what she had struggled to see in herself, not something faded, but something luminous. That night, as Margaret brushed her hair in front of the mirror, she no longer saw a woman mourning the loss of youth. She saw a woman who had loved deeply, who had learned, who had endured. She saw a woman whose beauty had not left. It had simply changed, becoming something richer, something that could not be taken away. Beauty is not behind us. It is not lost with the passing years. It is in the way we love, in the wisdom we carry, in the way we move through the world with grace. Margaret smiled at her reflection, at the silver in her hair, at the lines that held the stories of her life. She no longer wished to be the girl she once was. She was beautiful exactly as she was, in this moment, in this age, in this life. Margaret stood in her garden, her hands resting on the worn wooden handle of her shovel. The autumn wind carried a crisp scent, stirring the fallen leaves around her feet. In front of her was a small patch of earth, freshly turned, where she was planting a new rosebush. She had done this every year since her husband William had passed. She knelt down carefully, pressing her hands into the cool soil. "This one's for you," she whispered. William had loved roses. Every spring, he would tend to them with such care, talking to them as if they were old friends. He used to say that flowers carried memories, that every petal, every bloom, held a moment of love. Margaret had never thought much about it then, but now, as she dug her fingers into the dirt, she understood. Grief never truly goes away. It shifts, changes form, settles into the quiet spaces of life. At first, it had been an unbearable weight pressing against her chest, a hollow ache in the places where William's presence used to be. The empty chair at the breakfast table, the silence where his laughter once filled the room, the absence of his hand in hers during evening walks. For months, she had resisted it. She had tried to move on, tried to silence the pain. But grief is not something to be conquered. It is something to be lived with, something to be honored. The Buddha once told the story of a woman named Kisa Gotami, whose child had died. In her anguish, she went from house to house, begging for medicine that could bring him back. Finally, she was sent to the Buddha, who told her he could help, if she could bring him a mustard seed from a home that had never known death. Hopeful, she knocked on every door in the village. But every family she met had lost someone, a parent, a sibling, a friend. By the time she returned to the Buddha, she understood. Death was not her burden alone. It was woven into the fabric of life itself. Margaret had come to realize the same truth. Loss was not something that happened to her. It was something that happened to everyone. It was the price of love, the proof that we had truly lived and connected with others. And if grief was love with nowhere to go, then she would find a place for it. So she began planting roses. Every spring, when the first buds opened, she would sit in the garden with a cup of tea and talk to William as if he were there beside her. She would tell him about the children, about the small things in life, about the ways she still missed him. And in those moments, she felt his presence, not in the way she once had, but in a way that was just as real.
she also found new ways
to keep the love alive. She started cooking his favorite meals and inviting friends over to share them. She wrote letters to her grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandfather, the way he used to hum while fixing the car, the way he always smelled of cedarwood and fresh coffee. She made a habit of leaving small acts of kindness in his honor, paying for a stranger's coffee, helping a neighbor with their groceries, passing along the warmth he had given her. One afternoon, as she watered the roses, her granddaughter Lily came to sit beside her. The little girl watched as Margaret ran her fingers over a delicate pink bloom. "Grandma, do you miss Grandpa?" Lily asked softly. Margaret smiled, brushing a stray curl from Lily's forehead. "Every single day." Lily was quiet for a moment, then pointed to the rosebush. "But you're still planting his flowers." "Yes," Margaret said, her voice gentle, "because love doesn't stop when someone leaves. It just finds new ways to exist." Lily thought about that, then reached out and touched one of the petals. "Then maybe he's still here in the flowers." Margaret felt a lump rise in her throat, but it was not sadness. It was something softer, something warm. She nodded. "Yes, sweetheart. I think he is." Love never dies. It lingers in the stories we tell, in the habits we keep, in the quiet ways we honor those who came before us. It lives in the recipes passed down through generations, in the songs we hum absent-mindedly, in the laughter that echoes in our hearts long after the sound has faded. Margaret no longer feared loss the way she once had. She understood now that those we love never truly leave us. They become part of the world around us, part of the small moments we carry forward. That evening, as the sun set over her garden, she sat on the porch, a cup of tea warming her hands. She watched as the wind rustled through the roses, their petals, swaying gently in the fading light. She closed her eyes, listening. Somewhere, deep within her heart, she could still hear William's laughter. And in that moment, she knew. He was never really gone. Margaret sat on her porch, a soft evening breeze brushing against her skin. The sky was painted in shades of orange and violet, the last light of the day sinking below the horizon. She cradled a cup of tea in her hands, watching the gentle sway of the roses in her garden. These flowers, once planted in grief, had become a symbol of something else: endurance, love, and the quiet beauty of life moving forward. She thought back to the fears she once had. The fear of being forgotten, of losing the strength and youth of her body, of watching people drift away, of looking in the mirror and not recognizing herself. She had carried those fears for so long, but now they no longer felt heavy. They had softened, transformed into something gentler: acceptance. Aging was never about losing. It was about becoming. It was about learning to embrace the natural flow of life rather than resisting it. She had come to see that true beauty was not in youth, but in presence. That her body, though slower, was still worthy of kindness. That relationships were not meant to last forever, but that love never truly left. She had stopped trying to hold on to the past and had instead begun living in the richness of the present. She had found new ways to honor those she had lost, to celebrate the moments she still had, and to welcome the unexpected joys that life continued to offer. For the first time in years, she felt free. As she sat there, watching the stars begin to appear one by one, she thought of others who might be feeling what she once did: the loneliness, the longing, the resistance to change. She wanted to tell them what she had learned. Aging is not a punishment. It is a privilege. Every wrinkle, every silver hair, every slower step is a testament to the life you have lived, the wisdom you have gained, the love you have shared. The world may try to convince you that your value fades with time, but the truth is, you are more valuable than ever. You carry stories, lessons, and a kind of beauty that only comes with age. The years have not taken from you. They have given to you. So do not waste another moment mourning what is gone. Celebrate what still is. Love the body that has carried you through this journey. Let go of relationships that have run their course, and embrace new connections waiting to be made. Honor those you have lost by continuing to live fully, by carrying their love forward in the way you touch the lives of others. Margaret took a deep breath, her heart full, her spirit light. She had spent so much time fearing what lay ahead. But now, as she looked out at the vast open sky, she knew the future was not something to fear. It was simply another season waiting to unfold. If this message speaks to you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Let's walk this journey together. And if you found wisdom in these words, consider subscribing to Buddhist Life Philosophy for more insights on embracing life with peace, purpose, and mindfulness. Aging is not the closing of a book. It is simply the turning of a page. And the next chapter? It's yours to write.